Yes, distinguished speakers, thank you, Jen. Members of the eFuel Alliance, dear guests from both sides of the Atlantic, a warm welcome to today's event on implications of the Inflation Reduction Act for Europe. Is America first and Europe last? With the Inflation Reduction Act, the IAA, the United States adopted in the summer of 22 a multi-billion package to boost energy transition and to strengthen the industrial footprint inside the United States. The legislation includes $369 billion of funding for climate and energy technologies over the next decade. A key component of the IAA is a set of quite generous tax credits and incentive funding aiming to incentivize the development of renewable energy, clean energy technologies such as green hydrogen, CO2 technologies, and derivatives such as e-fuels. These fundings will lead to a significant ramp-up of production in the US. It is possible that the United States will achieve the necessary scale-up effects in mass production of e-fuels faster than the EU, making the American industry more competitive. It is expected that due to the IAA, the production of clean energy will be expanded significantly, and it will likely have a far-reaching impact on global climate and energy systems, supply chains, industries, and trade. The IAA clearly shows that the United States is taking a fundamentally different approach to decarbonization and sustainable economy than the European Union. With tax credits and subsidies, the US is pursuing a supply-side policy that makes clean energy available to the market and an economically feasible price. The EU, on the other side, uses carbon pricing, target setting, and the regulation as a main tool for decarbonization. These different approaches could challenge the transatlantic relations and lead to substantial trade tensions between the US and the EU. The European side fears that the incentives provided by the EIA could steer industrial actors away from Europe towards North America. We see that already, that some of the companies have a new foot in the States. Much more, it could even negatively impact the green transition in the EU. The EU Commission launched a package called Net Zero Industry Act as response. How does the IAA exactly look like? What is the political reasoning behind it? And is this package as threatening to the European industry as it is perceived? This is something which we really want to challenge today. How can we work together across the Atlantic for the benefit of both sides? Can we fix the problems by negotiating a free trade agreement, which frankly should have been done 8 years ago when the chance was given under the Obama administration? And these questions are the ones which are really interesting for, I think, both sides of us. And we will discuss them today in our event with a number of distinguished experts from both sides of the Atlantic. The eFuel Alliance, together with industry partners, commissioned a study providing analysis and conclusions on IAA and the NZAT IAA. All voices from the industry across the Atlantic we have on our panel later on. So a very special welcome to our guests from the US, to our colleagues from McLarty Associates who will share their expertise with us, but also the participants in the audience who came into this webinar and exchange ideas. I will now hand over to our moderator, Ralf Diemer. So let's look whether the Net Zero Industry Act is an appropriate and sufficient answer, and whether the European regulatory framework is as advanced as really a problem or not. And we see what we will find out today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Thank you, Monica, for handing over, and thank you very much for your welcoming remarks. Also from my side, a warm welcome. I'm Ralf Diemer, the Managing Director of the eFuel Alliance, and happen to be your moderator for today's event. and we are very happy to have a distinguished panel of speakers from both sides of the Atlantic, as Monica already stated. Just one remark on questions and answers. As Jan already said, by using the Q&A button, you can place questions anytime, or can forward questions anytime to us. I will try to forward them also to all the speakers. But also the speakers can, of course, look into the Q&A and can answer questions also by sending messages via the Q&A, especially then when questions are addressed particularly to certain speakers. So let's go and dive into it right away. And we start, since the IRA, of course, is a US regulation, we start, of course, with the US side. The colleagues from McLarty, starting with Ambassador Richard Byrd, will give us a first insight on the Inflation Reduction Act in the view of US politics. Ambassador Richard Byrd is Managing Partner, Europe and Eurasia, and head of McLarty Inbound by McLarty Associate, as said already, a Washington, D.C.-based consultancy. He is working with McLarty since 2007, but he started, of course, his career in public service. Most of us, I would assume, were politically socialized in the 80s, know him as US ambassador in Germany between 1985 and 1989. After that, he was in the business of negotiating nuclear weapons treaties. Before that, he was working in several areas in the State Department of the United States. After his career of public service, he switched to McKinsey, and as I said, since 2007, he is with McLarty. Welcome, Richard, to you, and you are giving us more the general political overview, and also maybe making us understand the reasoning a little bit more, which is behind the Inflation Reduction Act and the philosophy, so to speak, of the Biden administration. Richard, you have the floor.
Ralph, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank you, your colleagues at eFuels Alliance and others who are participating in this really interesting and timely event. You know, in trying to think about how I should begin my remarks, I think I have to say that 10 years or so ago, the idea that the United States would actually come forward with a massively expensive government-funded program to subsidize a major part of the U.S. economy, the energy sector, to develop new decarbonizing technologies would have struck people as science fiction. And I want to begin by just emphasizing what a radical departure the IRA and other actual initiatives that the Biden administration has undertaken in the 3 years of Joe Biden's presidency. And I think to understand this, you've got to step back from the existing politics in Washington, the existing discussion, transatlantic discussion between the EU and the United States over not just energy and decarbonization, but economics more broadly, and really go back to the early 1990s and the beginning of the post-Cold War era, because it was really in that early period, in the aftermath of the Cold War, that something that the economists now call the Washington Consensus came into being. And that is a phrase, the Washington Consensus, which reflects the views of economists on both sides of the Atlantic that the way for both Europe and the United States to grow and prosper in the post-Cold War period was through a policy that focused on liberal economics, a limited role for government, free trade agreements, and the general process of what became known through the 1990s and into the 21st century is globalization. The idea that the prosperity that free market economies had generated in the end of the 20th century could be extended worldwide to countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this Washington consensus became a consensus that was, I think, strongly supported, both in Washington, but in Berlin, in Brussels, in Tokyo, and in that era, people also hoped that it would become adopted by the Russians in Moscow and the Chinese in Beijing. That we had reached what one writer in a famous book called the End of History, that we had reached a point where there was a general agreement on how governments should govern and how economies should function. And I think the process, that consensus existed throughout the end of the last century and into the 21st century. But I would argue that beginning maybe with the financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, and continuing through the next 5 to 10 years through the pandemic, a lot of important political developments and economic developments have cast doubt on that original Washington consensus of free markets and free trade. One was the growing sense in both the United States and in Europe that offshoring, that investing in countries abroad was slowly leading to deindustrialization and hollowing out important parts of the U.S. economy and economies in Northern Europe. There was also as part and parcel of this was a growing, I think, political threat of populism, and you saw that most clearly in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, who in talking about the future of the American economy actually said while he was campaigning that the American dream was dead. So you had a growing populism.
Seems like the internet connection. Yes, Rolf.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I think we lost Richard. There he's back. You need to unmute yourself, Richard, sorry. Kannst du ihn unmuten, Jan?
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
Okay.
And so what you had with the incoming Biden administration was an effort to seek an alternative to what was then increasingly viewed as a failed model for economic growth and political stability. And what it was, in a sense, was a return as far back as the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, a view that government needed to play a more active role in guiding the economy and supporting the economy. That globalization, free trade, and market economics alone were not going to lead to the kind of prosperous politics that the United States needed to be able to resist the forces of right-wing populism. And so you need to understand, I think, the IRA is one of several initiatives that an activist government, the most activist government since possibly the Carter administration in the 1970s, as I was saying, perhaps even the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s in the Great Depression, an activist government that would come forward with projects and programs to fund the reindustrialization of the United States. Projects like the IRA, which would support companies that would move towards decarbonization. Projects like the so-called CHIPS Act, which would invest in high technologies to keep the United States competitive in semiconductor chips, which are seen as crucial to continuing American competitiveness. Other programs and projects like the administration's infrastructure bill, which would keep the country's infrastructure, particularly its transportation infrastructure, make the United States much more competitive, and would lead to, again, this process of reindustrialization. All of these ideas were laid out in a very important speech that was given earlier this year by the President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, at the Brookings Institution here in Washington. And in that speech, he actually talked about a new Washington consensus, which did have the elements of a more activist government in terms of spending and promoting industrial growth in the United States. Secondly, not a rejection of free trade, but more of an acceptance of what people like to call managed trade. It is a form of protectionism, and as some of you will know, the Biden administration has continued to pursue some of the protectionist trade policies, such as in the steel sector, that the Trump administration earlier pursued. So the Biden administration is no friend of free trade. And a third important element of U.S. policy is onshoring, and that is not sending jobs abroad that can be done in the United States. While there is a very, very vigorous debate amongst economists in the United States today over whether the United States needs or should have a growing manufacturing sector, the Biden administration and Joe Biden himself, who thinks of himself as a sort of product of the working class and is a strong supporter of the trade union movement, Biden himself strongly supports the idea of trying to grow manufacturing again in the United States. Now, needless to say, there are some really important key questions here that need to be addressed. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Kate, who will talk in just a moment, to address some of those. And I hope some of the questions also look at them. But one is, this isn't, of course, the first time that the U.S. government has gotten actively involved in trying to steer the U.S. economy. And the record in this regard is not necessarily a good one. When you pursue an industrial policy, you are essentially picking winners and losers. And so the question of one of the key questions for the IRA, it seems to me, is will the administration subsidize and pick the right entities to make the United States less dependent on carbon energy? Will this be money well spent, or will it be wasted? Another issue that has to, I think, be addressed in this regard is the administration has chosen not an entirely protectionist approach in terms of welcoming other companies into the United States to take advantage of the IRA. This is seen in Washington by some people as a good step and as something that the Europeans should welcome. On the other hand, there are those on Capitol Hill who don't like the idea of letting U.S. subsidies go to foreign companies. So this is a question that will have to be worked through in the U.S. Congress. There's also, I think, the question, the big political question. Needless to say, we are now just 1 year away from the 2024 presidential election. Legislation like the IRA, like the CHIPS Act, and others cannot be adopted and implemented in a couple of years. It'll take several years for them to work themselves through. If the Biden administration, if President Biden isn't reelected in 2024, and Donald Trump becomes the president again, in my judgment, the likelihood that the IRA will continue intact is probably open to question. And so the question then becomes, how sustainable are these big government spending programs, particularly in an era of volatile American politics? And then finally, a question I think which is really critical for the United States, but also for the Europeans, is the whole question of governmental debt. Of course, since the pandemic and after the pandemic, government spending and government activism has grown on both sides of the Atlantic, in part because of during the pandemic healthcare concerns, and afterwards the threat of populism and the recognized need to restructure and renew economies. But the question is, of course, is how long can the level of debt, which is now at historic highs, how long can that be sustained without introducing serious vulnerabilities in our economies and the tremendous burden of repaying that debt? So those are all questions, I think, that need to be addressed in looking at the Biden administration's whole concept of the new Washington consensus, and the, let's call it the jewel in the crown of this policy, which is the IRA. And with that, I'd happy to pass it on to my colleague Kate.
Ja, thank you very much, Richard. Jan, du müsstest mein Video bitte hochfahren. Ich kann das nicht selber machen. Thanks for this first broader political overview. I think it's very, very important also to understand the question which everybody in this audience, I think, ask himself, how sustainable will be the Inflation Reduction Act in volatile politics? I think this is a question many of us would have asked anyway, so thanks for your insight here. I would like to hand over to Kate Kalutkiewicz, as per Richard Bird already said. She's also working with McLarty and leads the McLarty trade practice and contributes to the firm's Euro practice and also McLarty Inbound. She has a long-standing career also in trade policy, one could say, or trade or economics, if you will. Also served in public service in her past, especially also in the White House and at the National Economics Council. But she also was senior director, U.S. trade policy, head of U.S. trade policy for Amazon as well. So a very interesting mix of steps in her career. And she will give us now some concrete insight from her view in the Inflation Reduction Act, and also especially, of course, the part which interests the audience the most concerning hydrogen fuels. So Kate, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ralph, and thanks to the Alliance for inviting both Richard and myself. We're very pleased to be here. The one thing you missed from my resume, I think, which I'm most proud of, but also, tags in a bit to something Dr. Griffon said at the beginning, was that I served both as the assistant chief negotiator for the TTIP negotiations, and then a time at the U.S. mission to the EU, where I was the senior U.S. trade representative to the EU. I arrived at the tail end of the Obama administration and then was present in Brussels for the election of Donald Trump and the subsequent, let's say, shakeup to transatlantic relations, which I think, I would have to agree with Dr. Griffon. We should have wrapped up that FTA years ago. I'm not sure when we're going to have another chance to do that again, regrettably, but probably is something that we should continue to push for as people who do support liberalized trade. Look, Ambassador Burt gave you a really good, I think, synopsis of where things stand. And as someone who also subsequently served in the Trump administration at the White House, where I worked for Larry Kudlow, you know, this trend toward managed trade, this trend toward industrial policy started before President Biden arrived in the White House. And I would argue in the run-up to the election of Donald Trump, this fallout around globalization and whether it had served the U.S. consumer and worker well was well underway. Of course, we saw that in Europe as well, in elections in France and Poland and in other key markets. But this question around whether the WTO, whether particularly the admittance of China into the WTO had been a gamble that had paid off. And I think that the Trump victory, the subsequent actions of the Trump administration, which went very far afield from traditional conservative Republican views on trade, demonstrated a pretty wide agreement among voters in the United States that in fact globalization, multilateral trade, broadening relationships with China had not served the interests of the United States. And so in some ways, this was well in train before the Biden administration. I think it was accelerated during the COVID pandemic when all of a sudden the American public and in turn the US politician tapped into this growing fear that critical supply chains, not only of medical supplies and personal protective equipment, but high-tech products that we needed for all of our manufactured goods, were in far-flung supply chains around the world, and in part controlled by actors like China, that people started to grow very wary of, about them restricting our access to the things we needed in a crisis, the things we needed for long-term economic growth. And so we saw a real push toward a new type of economic policy, which, as Ambassador Burt says, rightly veered toward protectionism. This was very difficult even for folks like, well, certainly like me, but other folks that I was working for in the White House to think through how to reconcile these two views. But it became very, very clear, and we saw this in Congress as well, that support for moving supply chains back to the United States, as some call nearshoring. Some Republicans tried to use terms like friendshoring, which hopefully is where we're trending, and that's relevant, of course, for those of you listening to this call today. Making sure that our supply chains were in economies that we could trust, that we would not have to maintain our reliance on economies like China going forward. So, you know, we saw this rash of industrial policy actions. Ambassador Burt again mentioned some of them. The CHIPS Act, of course, was the first major one. The IRA, the Build Back Better, which of course, when it was passed, became the bilateral infrastructure law, if I'm not mistaken. These are all huge, huge shifts, huge spending, huge commitments by Congress and the White House to take taxpayer dollars and incentives and try to shift production of high-tech goods, but also shift the U.S. economy to become more self-reliant in terms of clean energy. But also at the same time, we saw the increase in export restrictions. So not only are we trying to move everything home, but we're trying to also ensure that things do not move out. And taken together, I mean, this is a huge shift in how the U.S. economy is working. You know, Dr. Griffon also outlined a bit what the IRA has offered. I mean, I don't know that I need to go through all of that again. We can certainly pull that data for you, but it's you know, the most of the press is focused on the electric vehicle sector. But of course, the IRA and the BIL provide tons of incentives and subsidies for companies to come invest here, including European companies. I think to the point that Rick asked, are foreign companies welcome in the United States? The answer is a resounding yes. Provided, of course, that you make very clear that you are not coming from China and you are not working with China. And we can talk about that separately. Both the IRA and the BIL follow a trend line, I think, as well, which is to make very clear that you are welcome to invest in the United States. These subsidies are open for everyone, but of course, there are some very strict rules that companies investing and taking advantage of U.S. taxpayer dollars will have to comply with. And that's, of course, things related to steel and aluminum, utilizing these domestically produced metals in terms of infrastructure, ensuring that you are hiring U.S. workers, you are following prevailing wage rules, which of course I don't think would be issues for your companies. But the answer is a resounding yes. And we do, and Rick and I both service clients that are not U.S. clients that are very interested in tapping into some of these new opportunities. And many of you and your companies are already actively invested in the United States, particularly in the auto sector. And I think probably you would know very well, there's not a governor or a state legislature around the United States that would not welcome investment and jobs in their localities. Now, as I mentioned, there are growing and I think continuing concerns related to the potential investment of Chinese firms here in the United States. And there are still pending rules about what we call a foreign entity of concern related to, what type of investment or joint investment you might have with a Chinese firm. The reality is we have a very difficult political environment here. Both Republicans and Democrats, as we move into the election, I think have adopted a fairly, what we would call hawkish stance on China. And I think everyone politically can agree, no, we don't want Chinese investment in these sectors. The reality, of course, is that we can't succeed without tapping into some of the Chinese technology that has already been developed by the Chinese EV companies and others. It's very, very clear that the Chinese are quite active and control a dominant amount of the critical minerals that are necessary for success in the IRA and the BIL. And the Biden administration is I think having some difficulty coming to terms with how to take steps necessary to satisfy both a constituency that is concerned about China and a constituency that is concerned about the environment. And so we have not seen the end of this play out yet in the IRA context. And I think the Biden administration, we've seen it play out in real time with the labor unions striking in Detroit. That the labor unions do not want more Chinese investment. They also are not really bullish on more electric vehicle production in the United States, which does not use organized labor in the same way that traditional cars use. So I think as we move toward the election, the Biden administration is going to find itself increasingly dealing with this domestic problem of union support and of environmental support. So that's something that we continue to watch. It means that when you invest in the United States, it's very critical, I think, to think about allies within states. And these are the sorts of things that we at McLarty Inbound help clients with a lot, how to build constituencies of support in a very difficult political environment. Now, I haven't even touched yet on the Republican field. We have seen these issues come up in the debates. We have seen former President Trump, do events in Detroit at, traditional car manufacturers, calling the move to EV a disaster and a nightmare for the U.S. worker. He is tapping into this concern of the labor unions, and that's also creating some problems for President Biden. But President Trump has been pretty unequivocal that he thinks things like the IRA are not a good idea for America. Now, in some ways, he has been a supporter of industrial type policies, which make sure that manufacturing and jobs are happening in the United States. But I think everyone on this call is probably aware that former President Trump is not a big environmentalist. And so I think to Richard's point about what would Trump do if he were reelected, I mean, there are certain limits to what the president can do with an existing statute, but almost certainly I would guess that the president would relax certain Environmental Protection Administration guidelines related to tailpipe emissions and related to things that are pushing the timeframes of the IRA closer and closer. I would imagine that he would relax those, which, perhaps might be okay for businesses. But he would also take steps to divert some of this funding, I would imagine. Now, a lot depends on what the balance of power is in Congress as well, and I think we would have to see there. The last thing I'll mention is that these issues have also come up in the Republican debates. Again, industrial policy is not a traditional bailiwick of the Republican Party for the reasons that Ambassador Burt mentioned. These are massive amounts of spending. I think each of the candidates, not at last night's debate, but at the previous debate, all issued some kind of skepticism around the ability of the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. taxpayer to continue to fund these things. Whether or not, one of those candidates, assuming they win the Republican nomination and the general election, would reverse these things is for me remains to be seen. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kate. Maybe just one connecting question, a little bit more concrete. I mean, the audience, of course, is interested in the whole field of hydrogen and e-fuels. We know that there is a lot of tools in the IRA to promote that.
Yep.
Maybe you could possibly, in a very easy way, walk us through if a company from Germany, for example, would decide to participate in the scheme. But what would be, so a company who wants to produce e-fuels or hydrogen, what would be the steps to go, and what would be actually the funding, the tax incentives given for?
Yeah, well, both the IRA and the bilateral investment infrastructure legislation, include specific tax credits for hydrogen. I mean, there is a great deal of interest here in supporting the move toward green and blue hydrogen. And there are very specific tax credits within each of those legislations. I mean, I can tell you, there's a clean hydrogen production tax credit, which creates a new 10-year incentive for clean hydrogen. We have the Advanced Energy Project Credit, which is a 30% investment tax credit. There's a carbon capture and sequestration tax credit. I mean, I think that the authors of these two bills have been thinking very critically about how to support a move to clean hydrogen through the storage, through the infrastructure, through the actually producing and supplying hydrogen around the country. Now, how do you capture it as a foreign company? I mean, there are ways to come in and look at what's available. I mean, some of it is going to have to be, where is the infrastructure being built? As I mentioned, there are rules associated with these investments. There would be rules associated with using U.S. produced steel and aluminum for whatever is needed in the infrastructure. But again, I think assuming foreign clients and foreign companies are able to meet the eligibility requirements, these are programs, not only privately led investment, but through the BIL, government-led investment through Department of Energy and the various state level energy development agencies, have all sorts of programs that are being advertised.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Leah Puls. I think that goes also in this direction. What is the role of the different states in the USA regarding the IRA? Will they utilize these new incentives, and does this lead to a national climate action?
Sorry, will they neutralize what?
Will they utilize these new incentives?
Oh, utilize.
Yeah.
Utilize.
And does this lead to national climate action?
Well, yeah, no, for sure. We are already seeing new investments around the states. Now, I think in some ways, the states themselves can also offer their own incentive programs on top of the IRA incentives, as we have seen in lots of investments. So I'll just give you an example. Many of the companies that are members of the Alliance produce cars in the United States, and probably are well aware that U.S. states often provide lots of different types of investments for bringing foreign direct investment to their states. That might be free land. It might be, help building roads to access new facilities. I mean, I think what's happening is that the IRA has provided a whole new pot of money that makes it attractive to come to the U.S. And the states themselves are probably competing with one another, as they always do, to attract investment. Now, in this sector in particular, what we've seen trending is, of course, moves to the right to work states, the so-called right to work states. So where there are already facilities if, for example, you are servicing a particular industry or you are servicing a particular component part of a supply chain, that might be the place to go, right? In terms of hydrogen production and other clean energy sources, certainly the states which have already invested a great deal in green energy capture, the states which have really invested in solar and wind and hydro are also attracting foreign players that are able to tap into the energy that's already being collected for transition into the hydrogen.
And maybe a last concrete question from my side, because we always hear that important definitions are still missing coming from the administration, which is of course key. So, for example, what is actually, how do you understand renewable energy by the US administration? What kind of CO2 sources are allowed and are covered by the IRA? So we heard that should be something coming up in November, but we didn't see yet anything. Do you have any insights on that?
I don't have any predictions on when these things will come. I mean, I think you're right. And one thing that we talk to the administration a great deal about is that the lack of certainty around these very important definitional terms and eligibility criteria. The lack of certainty here is actually stopping the investments that you want, and companies are very nervous about making these decisions absent some really clear guidance. Some of the guidance, I can tell you, has been politically challenging. In particular, as I mentioned, the FEOC designation related to what percentage Chinese investment can be part of a project that remains stuck at Treasury, and that's of course because of a lot of the political reasons I mentioned. With respect to the very specific things you're asking on CO2 or some of the definitions around renewable energy, I don't have particular insight. What I'm guessing is that the Department of Energy is perhaps engaged in some political discussions with the climate groups here in the United States. The problem, of course, as you and your members will know, is there is a Venn diagram here between what is desired by the environmentalists and what the companies can do and what actually is in that center part to make sure that this is actually successful and has enough transition times built in to make sure that these things can be workable.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe a second part, and I would love to bring in Ambassador Bird once again, is the European answer to that. I mean, you mentioned already that there is a quite critical discussion in Europe about the IRA, perceived as a protectionistic tool to help the American economy and to even damage the European economy. There are answers in place called the Net Zero Industry Act, for example. But on a general opinion, how would you, if we would ask you as Europeans, how should we react and answer to the IRA? What would be your recommendation on
that? Well, that's a very good question, Ralph. I think I would say that given the political realities and the threat of populism on both sides of the Atlantic, my view is that one thing that European governments and the United States need to avoid in the long term is a subsidies war. I mean, it would be counterproductive over time for both sides to try to keep companies inside national borders by getting in a subsidies arms race, so to speak. So, I think that what both the EU and the United States need to do is make their territories, their economies attractive for reciprocal investment, providing different types of incentives and opportunities for American companies in Europe, as well as European companies in the United States. In my view, actually, these hydrogen hubs, this American concept, I think in the end could benefit Europe both in terms of transfer of technology, of know-how, of skilled workers. I mean, I think what we should try to do is maybe pursuing, and this will be tricky from a regulatory standpoint. The United States is not going to pursue a European approach to decarbonization by pricing carbon too high. That's just not a winning formula for the United States. So there will be different approaches, different regulations in Europe and the United States, and different pricing mechanisms. But to the extent that the two sides can share in technology transfer, in knowledge, then I think it can become a win-win. What Europe needs to do now, European governments need to do now, is tell the Biden administration, don't allow Congress or members of Congress to exclude European companies from coming into and taking advantage of the IRA. That seems to me to be that would be priority one, I think, for European governments and companies at this point.
Well advised. Thank you very much, Richard. I think what Monica said in the very beginning, everything would be much easier if we would have concluded TTIP 8 years ago. Unfortunately, that didn't work and that didn't happen. But at the end of the day, I think it's very clear the only pathway is to work together across the Atlantic. So it will be a very challenging but also interesting task to do so, and especially in our field of the upcoming economy of hydrogen fuels. So thank you very much for your insights from this point. With this segue on Richard's advice to Europeans, I would come now to our second part of the event, which is the presentation of a study we commissioned. The name of the study is Challenges and Options for E-Fuel Support in the EU and in the Light of the US IRA. Our colleagues from Frontier Economics have pursued this study. And we would like to start to present this study, of course. Presenter will be Dr. Michaela Unteutsch. She is one of the managers of Frontier Economics in the Cologne office. She's working there since 2014. And she has been particularly working on regulatory aspects in the energy market, on energy market design, and also especially in the field of hydrogen and green fuels. So a warm welcome to you, Michaela, and we are looking forward to the presentation of the study, which we commissioned together with partners such as Porsche, Stihl, and also N2X, who will also come into the discussion a little bit later on. But now the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will directly start to share my screen for a short presentation on the study. Can you see my screen, Ralf? Yeah. Perfect. Yes, so Ralf has already mentioned the title of the study. So we looked at challenges and options for e-fuel support in the EU against the background of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And with regard to the background of the study, I think this background should be clear by now after all the other talks in the webinar. The Inflation Reduction Act was signed in August 2022, and it provides significant financial incentives for producers of clean technologies, including e-fuels. In contrast, in the EU, we have a variety of different support mechanisms which are applicable to e-fuels, and we will come to this later. And also, as it has already been mentioned several times here before, there's also a proposal for a Net Zero Industry Act, which should act as a response to the Inflation Reduction Act. And against this background, the target of our study was to look first at the differences between the support schemes for e-fuels in the US and the EU, then to identify the challenges which exist with regard to the ramp up of the e-fuel industry in the EU. And the third part was to look at potential solutions with regard to these challenges. With regard to the methodology, of course, we did a review of the regulation, but then the core part of the study was the stakeholder workshops, which we held in spring of this year. And there we had workshops with stakeholders that are active in the e-fuel market, either in the EU or in the US, or in both markets, and in different parts of the e-fuel value chain. It was rather a short study, so also the report is less than 30 pages, so something you can read relatively quickly, and it will be published soon on the eFuel Alliance website. But now, taking a step back, the overall background of e-fuel support, both in the EU and the US, is the aim of reducing greenhouse gas reductions. So both the EU and the USA aim at becoming climate neutral by 2050. But the approach to support e-fuels differ fundamentally between the EU and the USA. So in the EU, we have a variety of different support mechanisms, and a large part of it is demand-side oriented, meaning that consumption is obliged, that a certain percentage of consumption must come from clean fuels, for example. And the idea behind this is that this obligation stimulates demand and also the willingness to pay for the clean product. And in addition, in Europe, not all regulations, but some of the regulations focus on specific usage cases of the fuels. In contrast, in the USA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, there we have a clear supply-sided support. So there is a direct support for producers of clean fuels, and the support is restricted to production within the US. But then once it is produced, the usage of clean fuels is left to the market. And against this background, as I've already said before, we had three parts, and I will now go through the three parts within the following slides. So first, we will look at the differences in the support schemes between the US and the EU. Then we will come to the outcome of the stakeholder workshops with regard to the challenges of the e-fuel industry in the EU, and as a last part, to potential solutions. So let's start with the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act offers support for producers through tax credits, which work as a direct reduction in tax liabilities, and then effectively it works like a stable revenue stream producers can receive over a predefined period of time. The funding is linked to production in the USA because in order to receive tax credits, you need to be a taxpayer in the USA. And regarding the overall financial volume of the Act, there are different estimations, also depending on which part of the Act you look at. One of these estimations is that about 360 billion dollars will be spent for the tax credits only until 2030. Then when it comes to the direct to the level of the individual tax credits, there are two criteria which are decisive for the level. One is whether social standards are fulfilled or not. If they are fulfilled, the tax credit is about 5 times higher compared to the base credit. And then the individual tax credit also depends on the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the clean fuel. The tax credits are available for different parts of the e-fuel value chain, as indicated on the lower part of the slide. So there are tax credits for the renewable electricity production, for electrolysis, for the further synthesis to e-fuel, and then also for the usage of e-fuels. And some of these tax credits can also be combined. So as an example, the tax credit, the production tax credit for renewable electricity can be combined with the clean hydrogen production credit. So in contrast, in the EU, we have a bunch of different support mechanisms, which can be roughly classified into 3 different categories. On the one hand, we have quota obligations. This is the pure demand-sided approach. Then we have measures which aim at reducing the cost gap between e-fuels and fossil fuels. And last, we also in the EU, we have some supply-side measures, however, with a limited financial volume only. With regard to quota obligations, of course, what's a very important regulation is the Renewable Energy Directive, and there we are currently at the 3rd version, which sets targets for the transport sector in 2030. And by 2030, member states can choose whether either greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced by 14.5% in the transport sector, or the share of renewables should be at least 29%. And then with specific relation to e-fuels, there is a quota for advanced biofuels and RFNBOs. For those who might not know, RFNBOs stands for Renewable Fuel of Non-Biological Origin, and in EU regulation, that's where e-fuels are grouped in. And this quota has an amount of 2.75% effectively by 2030. It is a quota for 5.5%, but as there is a multiplier of 2, both for advanced biofuels and RFNBOs, effectively it's a 2.75%. And similarly, there's a sub-quota for RFNBOs only of 0.5%. And in addition to these quotas which apply to the transport sector overall, there are quotas which are specific for aviation and maritime. For aviation, there is a quota for sustainable aviation fuels of 6% in 2030 with the e-kerosene sub-quota of 1.2%. And in maritime, it's a bit less clear there. The idea is more to look first how the market develops. But if the RFNBO share is lower than certain percentages in the early 2030s, then from 2034 on, a mandatory sub-target of 2% should come in. In the second category, we have the carbon pricing. We already spoke before with EU ETS 1 and 2. And we also have, however, only a proposal which came up in the framework of the Fit for 55 package to revise the Energy Tax Directive in a sense that fuels would be taxed according to the energy content and environmental impact rather than volume. And this would be beneficial to clean fuels because then they would pay lower taxes than fossil fuels. And with regard to supply side measures, only very quickly, one example is the European Hydrogen Bank with a budget of 3 billion euros, which subsidizes green hydrogen production, or the H2 Global, which subsidizes imports of green hydrogen and green hydrogen derivatives. And then, in addition to all these regulations, which are already in place or discussed, as a reaction to the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Commission came up with a proposal for the so-called Net Zero Industry Act. The point in common between the Inflation Reduction Act and the Net Zero Industry Act is that it aims to support the local economy for clean technologies. And in specific, the aim of the Net Zero Industry Act is that by 2030, the manufacturing capacity of net zero technologies and of indispensable components, materials, and machinery should make up 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs. Also a bit similar as the Inflation Reduction Act, it covers different parts of the e-fuel value chain, like from energy production from renewable energies, electrolyzers, CCUS. But then when it comes to the e-fuels themselves, in the current proposal, it only covers sustainable maritime and aviation fuels, which is a bit strange given that normally if you produce a fuel, for example, via Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, you get both e-kerosene and e-gasoline, for example. So while we have these points in common in the target setting between IRA and Net Zero Industry Act, the way the two acts work have nearly nothing in common. So we've seen before the Inflation Reduction Act provides substantial direct financial incentives to producers. In contrast, the Net Zero Industry Act offers no financial incentives at all. So it just builds on what is already there. And the core way of working, like how the Net Zero Industry Act should work, is by reducing the regulatory and administrative burden, for example, by streamlining the permit granting process. And it has many details. Just to give you one example, is that the Act states that there should only be one national competent authority who's responsible for facilitating and coordinating the permit granting process. So now, given this regulatory background, I will come to the outcome of the stakeholder workshops we had. And I think the first point is of no big surprise, given the support landscape we've just looked at, is simply that the support landscape is very complex, and very scattered across many individual regulatory measures. The second point, which was named most often, is that the level of regulatory risk is perceived as very high for different reasons. So one is that some regulations are still in the legislative process. Then for important regulations, a perspective for the timeframe beyond 2030 is missing. Like the RED III only defines a target for 2030, but not beyond. And then even if the overall European regulation would be clear, then most of the EU regulation is set out in directives that have to be transposed into national law. And altogether, this creates a lengthy regulation process during which market participants are unsure how exactly the framework will look like. And the third point is especially relevant if you compare the US support scheme with the European support scheme. So under the US IRA, producers have a fixed and stable additional income, while under demand-sided support, the revenues are less stable and predictable and depend on the prices which will come out on the quota markets. And now I will come to the last slide. with regard to potential solutions, given the challenges just raised. So the first point I've just talked about before is that under quota systems, revenue streams are more uncertain than under other support mechanisms, and this can play especially a role during early market phases. And there, some options would be to actually come through with the proposed revision of the Energy Tax Directive, because this would contribute to close the cost gap between fossil fuels and clean fuels, or to extend de-risking mechanisms like we have in place under the European Hydrogen Bank and H2 Global, however, with a very limited volume. Second, measures to reduce the level of regulatory risk would be, first of all, to provide a long-term perspective on the targets. So to provide a perspective for the timeframe beyond 2030, and other measures include, for example, or could include the implementation of grandfathering rules, which means that a certain regulatory environment is freezed for plants starting operation at a certain point of time. So not risking that someone invests and every 2 years the regulation is completely different. And a last point regarding a possible reduction of the complexity of the regulatory framework. There, the Net Zero Industry Act might be a first step with regard to the one-stop shop for regulatory procedures. But of course, it needs to be observed how this will work in practice. And yes, so thank you very much. And I think I will stop presenting to be able to answer questions. That's okay.
Of course. Thank you very much, Michaela, for this comprehensive presentation. We have also Dr. Jens Partner from Frontier Economics in the call. To the audience, that will be now the time to place your questions. So please type in the Q&A session your questions, whatever you want to know. Usually the colleagues from Frontier are able to answer whatever you want to know. So, oh, and there is Caroline Baum as well. Hello, I didn't recognize you. I'm very sorry about that. So please bring forward your questions. So in the meantime, maybe I start kicking off the Q&A session with one more general question. I mean, clearly, if you see the comparison you made, it's kind of, if you say IRA versus Net Zero Industry Act, it's kind of 3.0 win for the IRA, so to speak. But did you, also in your talks with the respective companies, did you see any downsides actually in the IRA which you could identify?
I think the question is only for whom. So honestly, in the discussions with with the industry, which might be interested in investing, we didn't see downsides. But of course, overall, for the US, it's a large investment. And as we have discussed before, it needs to be seen whether or how this pays out and how things will develop once subsidies will cease, like for in 2030. Will it be maybe like in Germany, where we invested a lot into PV, the PV industry, and the industry is not here anymore. But from a pure e-fuel producer perspective, we didn't see downsides.
Okay, no good news for us, right? I would say for us Europeans in that case. So there comes a question from Roman Mauschat. he's asking, it is unclear to me why the research points to uncertainty from the regulatory side. Refuel EU, for instance, sets targets as of 2025 up until 2050 with intermediary targets. It provides thus suppliers with visibility in the long term. In addition, there will be a supply side instrument with SAF allowances and CFDs.
Yes, that's true. And with this regard, the target setting for the aviation and the maritime sector is a good example. So, so if you read the report, the idea is more what is already clear, but only for a small part for the transport sector, would also be needed for the rest. So for the other parts of the transport sectors, it is not clear what will happen after 2030.
All right, but I mean, in general, it's right. It's a big obstacle, I would say, in the Renewable Energy Directive that it's only setting targets until 2030. The refuel aviation, of course, is a different story in that respect. Reinhard Otten asked, talking about e-fuels, which sectors on the demand side are expected to be the most interested in the US? I don't know if you can answer this question. Otherwise, we also have Fran Bowell from McLarty in the call. So maybe it's also a question I could address to her, because there's also another question which I would like to address to Fran later on. I don't know, Michaela, you can answer that, or sure? Oh, okay, no, Fran, go ahead.
No, I think that's...
Yeah.
So thanks very much for including me. I think that in terms of e-fuels, I think we'll see the same things that you're seeing in Europe, with an emphasis on aviation and to some degree maritime. As many of you may know, we have extensive rules regarding maritime traffic being US based or US owned if you're going port to port. So I think I would expect that domestic fuel would be required. But I think that's probably where it will go, and potentially heavy goods vehicles. But I don't see a real difference in the way the US will use e-fuels from what we're seeing in Europe.
All right, thank you very much. And Fran, if you're still on, there was one question which is actually very interesting, referring to what Rick Bird said when he said carbon pricing will not be a formula used in the US, and that is exactly what the participant wants to know. Why is this?
So I think that in our system, the political debate about climate is still ongoing. And so attempting to get legislation through that would establish a carbon trading system or some other way of calculating a price, I think is going to be exceptionally challenging for quite some time to come. What I would look to instead is actually the introduction of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the EU. This is now, as I think your attendees will know, it's now in a reporting phase, and I think it's in 2 years that you actually start paying. There is an effort within the US-EU Trade and Technology Council to create a common way of measuring carbon emissions, a common methodology, or at least some kind of mutually recognized way of doing that. US products under CBAM will have to account for their carbon emissions. And I think that in some ways, and will be charged according to those carbon emissions. We'll have to buy credits under the European system in order to import those goods or export the goods from the United States into the EU. And they will work with their European importers to make sure that they get the required certificates, that they know what the emissions are, et cetera. And they will do this based on the European methodology, unless the US comes up with something else in an incredibly swift way. And so I think that within certain industries, the industries that are covered by CBAM right now, this is probably going to become the way that a carbon price is introduced. And it will be through those companies that are exporting to Europe in those particular technologies, in those particular products.
Very interesting point. Thank you very much. A question to, I think that would be a question for Frontier again, from Lea Puls again. She's asking with regards to reaching the climate goals. I mean, we always talk about business opportunities here, which is rightly to do so, but of course, the whole effort is also about reaching the climate goals at the end of the day. Do you have any judgment which policy tool you would see as the most effective one, IRA or the EU demand-side regulations?
Maybe I can step in for this question and just provide a bit of a view. So I think there are different strengths and, let us say, weaknesses of the different approaches in the US on the one hand side and in the EU on the other hand side. So the demand side measures are quite well placed to control the usage of fuels and emissions in the medium and long term. You can set, let us say, the targets for the customers, which share they should use as green fuels or as e-fuels in the energy mix. So the let us say the outcome is quite clear. So the instrument is directly based on the outcome. So this is quite a good instrument for controlling what's happening on the emission side. And this is a bit comparable to the EU ETS, where you just set, let us say, a maximum amount of CO2 emissions, and only these emissions are allowed in the whole system. So there's a direct steering. So this is a bit of an advantage of the system, and there's quite a bit of flexibility for customers or for the stakeholders to react to those requirements which are set in the obligation system. Let us say the disadvantage is that you have quite a bit of uncertainty especially when you set up the system at the very beginning. So the markets are not very mature. It's all starting. And there the US system has a bit of an advantage since it's directly addressing the de-risking needs of the investors in the system. And this is very well placed just to get things started. Obviously, it's also very much motivated by industrial policy. So not only about climate protection, it's very much an industrial policy instrument, but it's very well placed to provide the incentives at the very beginning. So one solution for the EU would be to have a bit of a strengthening of the combination of both elements, let us say. For the medium and long term, the obligation demand side based obligation systems are a good instrument to get where you want to end up at the very end on the climate policy side. But at the beginning, it would be good to strengthen the de-risking elements, which are already there somewhere in the system, but they seem to be very weak. And what we have heard from the stakeholders, they are too weak to really de-risk the investments which are necessary for today. And to strengthen these elements at the beginning, and then maybe phasing out those elements in the later stage when then the demand side measures kick in more intensely, might be a good solution or let us say a balanced way forward, which then addresses it. And one thing to add to that is if we look on the EU, we can't copy the US system anyway, since the EU doesn't have the responsibility for tax policy. So this is in the member states, which means we have to find other ways. But let us say a balanced system with a strong supply side measures at the beginning and then phasing in more into the demand side measures would serve the purpose as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I add one? Can I add one?
Sure, please.
So one of the things that I have been made aware of is that the European system, because of its targets and the demand focus, specifically for renewable or green hydrogen, actually privileges green hydrogen to some extent, while the US system is technology neutral between blue and green. So I think there is a difference in terms of long-term emissions, but also in terms of whether you end up creating a market for green hydrogen as opposed to clean hydrogen, and whether that is something that's considered desirable or worth pursuing or not. So I would just make that one more difference between the two systems right now. Of course, we still have, as the report points out, a great deal of uncertainty about the specific targets at the member states for green hydrogen, as well as past 2030.
Yeah, a very good point. Thank you very much, friend. So I would urge you please to stay on because more questions are coming in, but we still have also some industry voices which I would like to bring in quickly because I assume they also have their views on many of the questions we are having. And I would like to start with N2X and its Director General, Professor Dr. Christian Büchen. So Christian, welcome to our event. Christian is since November 2021, he's the Director General of N2X, which is the Association for Fuels and Energy in Berlin. He's an engineer by profession, quite interesting profession given the fact that he's mainly working in politics. So that's not necessarily very common, but of course his background is also one coming from the energy sector, the fuel sector. He was working with German Shell in Hamburg for a long time. And Christian, welcome to our panel, and I would like to give you the opportunity for a short intervention, and then of course we carry on also with further questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. I hope you can hear me well. It's working. Yeah. Okay. Great. Great. Yeah. Many things said. Many I can agree to, and some more input and assessment from an industry and an industry side who is supposed to be part of the investors in e-fuels on the long run, or even on the short run. First of all, we learned that mandates as instruments work quite well if a product is available. If you look at first generation biofuels, mandates worked quite well to bring them into a market. You could buy them, pass on the price, at least that worked. And the question is, do mandates or quota obligation, as you named it, do have the same effect if we look at new technologies, not only new technologies that are not mature, where you have not only regulatory risks, as you mentioned, where you have market risks, what's the price in 20 years for these products, because you have an upfront investment. And I've seen a couple of projects. If you want to produce a couple of 100,000 tons of e-fuels, the first investment is more than $1 billion or dollar, whatever you take at the beginning. So does it really work? You have technological risks because the technology are not all of the technologies are mature. You have market risks and regulatory risks, and the clear answer I must give at the moment, because we are discussing it especially in the aviation sector, where we have long-term objectives. So different from the renewables objectives, I fully agree 2030 doesn't help at all. If my first plant is built in 2030, so I won't build it because of an objective in 2030, because it has to operate more than normally these kinds of plants 20-30 years. So I need so obviously mandates don't work well. But even in aviation, where we could see a growing market because of the mandates, we see now less than 1% of the announced projects globally has a final investment decision. And we are in really difficult discussions with the government. Mandates simply don't work for the investments well. And we have a mandate for PTL SAF in Germany since 2 years. It starts in 2026, and it will not be well. The second question regarding mandate is, will there be it's more about the details. Will there be a buyout mechanism? If there are not, is there a set penalty or not? That could help, but on the other hand, even the penalty doesn't guarantee you a price for the next 20 years. And if you do such an investment, you need it. And I'm not quite agree to what Jens Perner said. Even markets, more mature markets like the electricity market with wind and solar, you still are not valid mandates. You're trying to find instruments that guarantee the investments for if you build up windmills and solar panels now. So it's, I'm not sure whether it works. For all these measures that create needs upfront investment, and for e-fuel, it's really high investment. So this is something to be discussed. So we need de-risking options. That for sure. You mentioned some. Another comment regarding CO2 pricing. This could be an instrument. Just to give you something about the order of magnitude. If you assume that if an e-fuel costs in production €1 or $1 per liter more than the fossil fuel, you would need a CO2 price to compensate for that of around €400 per ton CO2. That's about the magnitude. If we take the taxes on gasoline, we could reach up to 275 or something, €300 per ton CO2. But for the first investment, I suppose it won't be enough. On the long run, it can help. It creates an incentive, and it's in a way similar to the IRA. It's the only companies who are obliged are similar parties. May save, in that case, energy tax and not income tax, but it could have a similar impact. The only question is that sufficient for the first plants? And the second thing is, if we look at, and when we have ETS2, it's not only ETS1 for aviation emission trading scheme, if politicians would allow having that work, it could work. We assume from when it starts in 27, as decided by the EU, we can see in very short time high prices. But what we think as investing industries, we do not think that the politicians will allow that high prices. We expect that they will interfere. And so CO2, and the same can happen, of course, to taxes. So it doesn't provide, CO2 pricing will never provide the same security for investors when programs for like H2 Global or things you mentioned as examples. So CO2 pricing, we think, is the more effective instruments on the long run than mandates. I really doubt that mandates work for these investments, especially as you do not know how big the markets will be in the future. If you look at road transport, this is the key question. I don't see that much investments will be done just for road transports, because on the other side, politicians decide on bans of combustion engines, not only for passenger vehicles, but unfortunately for heavy duty vehicles as well, so as it looks like at the moment. So this makes it quite difficult to create these business cases. So I agree to what we need some de-risking mechanisms, but they are far too small. We need probably longer term incentives. So 10 years is not much. 20 years looks much better. And we need to discuss how the money comes into the system, because tax income of the member states is probably not enough to finance all that. So financing mechanisms will be key to build up real fast production. Last remark, from a European perspective, we will need to import a lot, and to keep value chains here, to keep industry here. We didn't talk about chemical industry. They will need hydrocarbons on the long run. It makes a lot of sense to develop a global market for Fischer-Tropsch crude, so synthetic crude in a way, and for methanol as well. E-methanol will be another thing. We think it makes a lot of sense to have global markets for these products, and to build them up, we will need incentives for investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. But if I understand you well, then it's a clear statement for a scheme like the Inflation Reduction Act at the end of the day, right?
In a way, yes, or something similar like H2 Global or things like that. It needs much more money than it's in there at the moment. It's
understood.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much so far. So please, if you have further questions, bring them up. We will try to answer all of them. I would like to bring in also Arne Philipp Siemens from Porsche AG. Porsche is also a supporter of this, or a co-commissioner of this study. And of course, Porsche is on a global scale quite small, but nevertheless a very global company. So you are in the US and have traditionally a very high footprint in the US, as well, of course, as in Europe and in any other relevant market in the world. And in addition to that, for Porsche, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is not only, and supportive schemes in general, is not only about fuels, it's also about electrification, batteries, because, of course, you are also very heavily invested into electrification and electrify your fleet. So be a very interesting perspective to bring also in this part of the story. And Arne is an engineer as well. He worked in research and development, started in Audi first, and is since a short time joined Porsche and is working on renewable fuels and renewable energies in Porsche AG. He's the coordinator for that. So please, Arne, your statement.
Yes, thank you. Let me just reflect the event and the study very short. So as we heard, we have a high complexity and a high regulatory risk and revenue risk on the European side for investors through the regulatory framework of the Green Deal. On the other hand, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, but there we heard already today, we have eligibility criteria that are not 100% clear yet. We have no quota system, and we have no CO2 pricing mechanisms like in the EU. And we have, unfortunately, no stock fleet measures in regulatory framework. So to point out very effective mechanisms in the EU, like the European Hydrogen Bank, this mechanism at the moment is only for domestic investments, but on the other hand, it's non-discriminatory for its solutions, which makes it also very attractive for investments. On the other hand, the NZIA, in contrary, is partially discriminatory with regards to its solutions, but sets clear targets. So we have kind of a competition between the systems. So the price risk in quota systems alone, we heard it in the presentation, that could be targeted with feed-in tariffs or other solutions we had in Germany and the EU in the past. But one thing we have to point out is that the quotas at the moment, especially for the stock fleet, are way too low. And for the red, we don't see them continuous for 2030. And of course, the EU tax directive, this new amendment and regulation, this thing should be solved, because there we see a very high potential for investments for fuels due to tax relaxation. So other points are the ETS restriction we practically still have at the border for importing renewable energy. This is something that should be solved. For example, if you want to import refuels, e-fuels from South America, you still have these ETS border restriction, which makes it a little complicated. And of course, we have no enlarged grandfathering rules. That means we have not a complete investment security. and we cannot use, the industry cannot use point sources for a determined decade. To point this out, if you observe the Chinese market closely, you will find that the point sources there are in a way a very central part of the solution. So one thing also, the auction mechanism, which on the one hand is a good thing, but on the other hand, if there's not enough investment budget for everyone, then the winner takes it all, and this mechanism might be kind of a bottleneck. So we analyzed the IRA closely, and we think it is an uptake for H2 economy. And I say H2 because it's non-discriminatory with regards to the technological solution. You have the clean electricity production and investment credit, clean hydrogen production and investment credit. So you can combine the tools as we have seen, and which makes it possibly very attractive to use renewable energy and then hydrogen, and then do with this hydrogen whatever the market demands. So one thing that hasn't been pointed out today is also that Canada has something similar. It's part of the study. I recommend everyone to read the Canada chapter, because there you can also invest in these technologies. And due to the big surfaces the US and Canada have, this makes both very attractive. So frankly speaking, the push for hydrogen with an open and neutral path for its derivatives is what you can see if you analyze the IRA closely. And we will then observe if the market, the physics, and the technology can or will form the multiple paths for H2 and its derivatives. So we see IRA also pushes renewable electricity. It pushes the EV ramp up, which we as a group acknowledge in a very positive way. And we see that also these instruments further push the transformation. Renewable electricity helps charging for EVs, and the IRA with its supply chain subsidies helps the construction of EVs. So the IRA activates the supply chain. This is what you can shortly say about the IRA. Considering for fuels, it activates the hydrogen and the renewable electricity as a baseline for the supply for energy carriers, and it activates the supply chain for EVs. So it's well done from the point of view of an environmental engineer, who I am. And we have to point out the things that are still lacking. It's the global machine park. The global machine park, whatever machines, it has to be addressed, and this has to be addressed with e-fuels. And we need it because the CO2 budget globally is declining, and the e-fuels are the solution for the stock. And it is our plan B to get our climate goals in place. So, of course, we see some partial mechanisms like multipliers in regulations. And I want to give the thought, are multipliers not maybe some kind of double crediting mechanism? So there are still some things which Dr. Unteutsch pointed out, make the amounts of e-fuels lower than they could be. But we still have to see also in the US, where are the eligibility criteria? These things are also important. So I'm completely with Mr. Bird's conclusion. You have to make countries attractive for investments. This is the major goal that has to be achieved for both sides of the Atlantic. And there was a question to the aviation and maritime. Yes, that is a really good thing in the EU, these quotas. But if you calculate them from a point of view of an engineer, you see that these amounts are pretty much little. The kick-in is in the 40s. And we would need road transport in the stock to really ramp up these volumes. And technology is tradable. Fischer-Tropsch, methanol, it's all tradable and multiple use and modular. So the stock lever is in our thought the key. E-fuels can really relieve the climate targets. And to conclude, we have to combine the solutions from the US, the investment solutions, with the quota solutions from the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arne. Very good insight, and I think that is also the perfect segue to David Sasiski. Since Arne is representing a company, a German-based global operating company, David Zazinski represents a US-based future global operating company. Infinium is one of the fuel producers, the e-fuel producers, who have great plans for participating in this market. And David is the Vice President, Governmental Affairs and Policy at Infinium. He's actually an engineer himself as well in the field of chemistry. So we have a lot of expertise in the technical field today here at this panel, which is very good. And I would be, or we would be very interested in having your perspective from the US side as a company on these two schemes we have, and especially also on the IPA. So please, David, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for the Alliance for putting on the event. As Ralph mentioned, Infinium is a producer of electrofuels. Our product slate includes eSAF, which is sustainable aviation fuels, e-diesel for road and marine applications, and e-naphtha, which can be used as a premium blend stock in the gasoline fuel pool or used in the production of green chemicals or precursors to green plastics. I think the important part to think about the e-fuels that we produce, as well as the industry is producing, they're drop-in compatible with the existing fuels. What that means is they're fungible. They can be used worldwide. And so given that the cost of infrastructure of producing fuels and moving fuels around, these really become global commodities that can be fully traded and fully utilized across the world in different jurisdictions. And to just kind of frame Infinium, we're developing a portfolio of projects. We have over a dozen projects in development across the world in multiple geographies, including the United States, within Europe, within Asia, and Australia. We're standing up our first facility in Corpus Christi, Texas. We're very soon to be delivering our first fuels to our announced offtake partner, Amazon, for use in their middle mile trucking fleet. And we have subsequent projects we're bringing online to expand the volumes of e-fuels within the market. I do want to just deposit, I know we've covered a lot of ground today. I do want to just deposit a few thoughts on the policy front. I think it's important to think that we should reflect that just 24 months ago or so, e-fuel policy was effectively a blank slate. It was really a blue sky opportunity. Yet in this very short period of time, we've seen transformative actions taken by a number of countries, including what we talked about here, the United States and EU, UK as well, and many others are advancing that discussion and those policy frameworks today. Talking about Japan, Canada, and others. But what I'd like to do is just kind of briefly try to frame a good takeaway message, a way to think about the policy landscape. I think the policies right now, as we look globally, they're really geared at kind of two elements. One is standing up new e-fuels production facilities. And then the second is attracting e-fuel volumes into the market. And in particular, into new markets that haven't been served with alternatives. We're talking about aviation and maritime as examples. I would contend that I think policymakers should really be looking at a balance of these two policy dimensions. That one dimension is incentives geared at standing up domestic production facilities. Obviously that can be done in many ways, reduce the friction to stand up facilities, permitting and otherwise, incentives to allow you to stand up those facilities. And obviously the underlying driver of that is the economic impacts and the jobs to the local economy. On the other dimension is incentives geared towards attracting e-fuels to the market. And that can come from both that domestic supply facilities that are established, as well as importing e-fuels from other third countries. And obviously the gain there to be had is really how you extract the environmental aspects from the use of the e-fuels. And I think it's fair to say, maybe there's a little blurring the lines there if we think globally that whether the fuel's used in the country of origin or if it's exported to others, we're all beneficiaries from a long-term perspective. But what I would say is these two elements are not mutually exclusive. We will have I think success can be had by really weaving policy elements that touch on both countries to make sure that they're a magnet market for e-fuels and an opportunity to install a domestic-based production of e-fuels. I think right now, as the policy landscape has kind of evolved in the US, it's definitely tilted more towards incentives that is looking at domestic production, but open-minded for moving those fuel volumes internationally or outside of the United States. And then whereas in the European side, kind of driven by the mandates, you got a bent that's more towards being a magnet for e-fuels. And I think levelizing both these policy elements, both domestic production and being a magnet for e-fuels, becomes a winning mix so that we can all participate in both those dimensions, and more importantly, provide kind of that innovative or incentive thrust, which is critical when you're really trying to stand up a new technology innovation, and particularly in a very capital intensive, a very difficult basis, which is the energy industry, to be successful. So I'll leave it there in terms of thoughts, and happy to answer questions.
Great, as always. Thank you very much, David. Maybe just one, since Infinium, as you stated, is planning to be present in basically all relevant markets, but especially also US and Europe. If you would have one special wish, either to the European side and to the US administration side, to make it to improve the system, what would be vice versa the wish you would like to express?
You know, I think, and I'll speak for Infinium, but I think you can also think about it industry-wide here, e-fuel industry-wide, is there is no uniform standard for electrofuels. The criteria in one jurisdiction is different than others. And so what it's created from this world market is kind of lumpiness and frankly complexity to try to navigate this technology. That's difficult when you're at an early stage of technology. It adds in that regulatory complications. It adds in that dimensions. Just frankly explaining this to investors becomes a full-time job in and of itself. Now, I don't know how we turn back the clocks because we are where we are, but I think long term, I think having kind of that frictionless ability to have some uniformity across these different policy incentives and regulatory frameworks, I think will be a long-term benefit. In the near term here, I think companies like Infinium and others will navigate those waters, but it adds a little extra waves or chops to the equation that maybe wasn't necessarily necessary, but it is what it is.
All right, and maybe the question also to Arne, put it a little bit different, because as I said, Porsche is also heavily invested in electrification. So of course you have to make sure that you have battery cells available. Did the IRA in any field affect future investment decisions of Porsche already? And if yes, in what way?
The answer is indirectly. When it comes to the electrofuels, Porsche is partnering with HIF, Highly Innovative Fuels, HIF Global to be concrete. And we are also investor in HIF. And we don't produce the fuels ourselves. At the moment, we purchase them from the Haruoni pilot plant in South America, Chile. So HIF has also announced plans to build up a gigaplant in Matagorda in Texas in the US. So the IRA is, of course, also in indirect ways then in affecting HIF for their investment in Texas. And from what officially has been announced, HIF is planning and analyzing to maybe use subsidies. Of course, these information then has to come directly from HIF, but the investment plans in the US are clear, and we are indirectly as a shareholder from HIF also then looking closely in the IRA and of course consulting there.
All right, thank you very much. So we have 3 more questions from the audience, and I think that's perfect to wrap up our Q&A session. First, we have a question from an anonymous listener. Most of the support mechanisms, tax credits under the IRA, are set to expire before 2030. The e-fuel market will remain very immature until then. Do you see this as a risk for the e-fuel production market in the US on the long term? I think David already covered that a little bit with his demand that we will need long-term solutions. I don't know, Fran, what do you think about that?
I think it depends entirely on the politics in the United States over the next few years. If you want to establish or to extend credits, it will happen during the next administration, I think, whichever that is. And I would point out that it's not only the presidential election to be looked at, but also the congressional election here in order to make extended credits a reality.
All right. Then there is another, please, I will just read the question. Somebody can step in who would like to answer this question. Transition, it's a question from Yamila Simkova. Transition to clean fuels is one point, but lowering the absolute amount another. So the US has one of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita, namely in sectors for electricity and heating and transportation. Are there any plans to look into further lowering greenhouse gas emissions per capita? It's maybe a little bit specific. I don't know if anybody can step in here.
I can try one answer, and this would be one reason why Porsche is also strongly investing in electrification. If we lower the demand of fuels in total, then we can reach higher percentages of drop-ins in whatever subsector that we have. So frankly saying, electrification is also helping the e-fuels ramp up. That's why also EV policy is important in this place. You have to combine the instruments.
I don't know, Christian, would you agree to that?
Partly for investor, it makes it difficult if we look, and we fully agree we will need for the existing fleet, and for climate reasons we need e-fuels for the road transport sector as a whole. But on the other hand, for investors, it's rather difficult. And on the other hand, of course, electricity is needed in other sectors as well. So the increasing demand in the heating sector were the same by heat pumps or by electric vehicles, makes it more difficult for industry in Europe to have energy prices that they can afford. So we are aware of all sorts of renewable electricity. The key is to increase supply, whether it's green electricity or green fuels. I think every investment helps so far, I would agree.
Yeah. So there is another question. I think that would be also going to Fran again, because Anne Siemens already, it's from Reinhard Otten from Audi. Anne Siemens stated that you also need instruments to increase the demand for green energy on the demand side. I think that is something also in other statements we heard that already. In order to have a long-term perspective for green fuels, are there any instruments like this in place or in preparation in the US?
Not that I have come across. And in fact, I've been dealing with companies who see Europe as an excellent market for green hydrogen, precisely because Europe does have the demand side incentives, or at least is developing those. And they believe that in the United States, blue hydrogen will be less expensive over the long term, and therefore will become to be more market dominant unless the US does what the question asks, which we aren't yet doing, which is to create any incentives on the demand side.
All right, then maybe one last question I would steer to frontier economics. If you would have 10 minutes with, let's assume Ursula von der Leyen will be the next Commission President. And somehow next year in November, you would have 10 minutes or 20 minutes with her to discuss the schemes and the supportive schemes on European level in the European Union. What would be the 3 major wishes you would pass her forward?
Ralph, that's a very good question. I think there's a bit of a bottom from what we have heard here. And I think that this is also what I would tell to her. The first one is just set long-term reliable policy goals for introducing e-fuels in not only in parts of in some sectors, but across all of the sectors, and make clear what you want to have in the long term, and set targets which are ambitious enough to drive the demand side in the medium and long term. And I don't see this yet, so there's something to do. The second one is, right now in the short term, we have to strengthen the supply side measures like H2 Global and so on, and ramp them up. So this is they're currently very cautious attempts to introduce those measures, but I think we need more of a push here in order to overcome the first mover disadvantage, which Christian already has mentioned. This is the second one. And the third one is put the Net Zero Act in place and try to reduce the complexity of the system so that investors see clearer what's really happening. I think the idea is very good, but now action has to follow, right? And this really has to put in place, and not only on the paper, it has to be seen in practice. And I think if these 3 things are put in place, I think we have let us say, a path to the future in the short, medium, and long term. And this would be a good combination.
All right, I think that wraps it nearly perfectly up, at least from the European side. I mean, clearly we heard that even though the Inflation Reduction Act is quite unique exercise in the American history, you could say. That is something we heard from Ambassador Byrd at the beginning. Of course, there is still also work to be done to put all the necessary definitions and clarifications in place. That is actually, by the way, quite similar to the problems we have with the European Commission. I mean, we waited around 2 years for the delegated acts. So I really hope this won't be that long in the US administration, but of course, administrations tend to be a little bit slow from time to time. Of course, that was also said that there's a high political uncertainty, more maybe on the US side than on the European side right now, but on both sides, because we really don't know how the election, we also have European elections next year for the European Parliament, how this will play out and what that will mean to all these schemes we are relying on right now with our investments. And what I'm sure, again, that's nothing new for us, I think. The work of the e-Fuel Alliance and all its partners will not be done by the end of the year. I think it's very clear it just started. And there will be much more discussions and work to do to bring electro fuels at the end really up to a upscale production and to contribute to achieving climate goals at the end of the day. So with that, 502, thank you very much to all our speakers, especially to our friends from across the Atlantic, Fran, Rick, Kate, to join us for this event. Thanks also to all the other speakers from our membership, from N2X, David Sasiski and Arne Philip Siemens from Porsche, and David Sasiski from Infinium, of course, and our colleagues from Frontier to do this study for us and to present that in this event. And then, of course, to all of you, have a very good afternoon, a very good rest of the week. Stay healthy, and stay tuned for our next event in the eFuel Alliance. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.